My son told me to give away the lake house I built with my late husband's hands to his wife's parents. I said yes, on one condition. 7 months later, that house was listed for sale. And the truth I dropped on the birthday cake that night destroyed the entire family. Before it saved us. Before I tell you what happened, I want to know who's listening tonight. Tell me where you're watching from. Comment your city below. I read every single one of them. And if you love your grandma, even half as much as I love my grandkids, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now let me tell you what happened at Cedar Hollow Lake. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 75 years old, and I have lived long enough to know that when someone tells you they love you right before they ask you for something big, you should listen very, very carefully to the next sentence that comes out of their mouth. It was a Sunday afternoon in June when my son Matthew came to my house with his wife, Rachel. They didn't call ahead. That should have been my first warning. Matthew has never once in his adult life shown up at my door without texting me first. Not since he moved out at 22. But that Sunday, he knocked, and when I opened the door, I saw his face, and I knew something was coming. They sat across from me at my kitchen table. The same table my husband Robert built with his own hands almost 40 years ago. Rachel kept smoothing her skirt with her palms, over and over, like she was trying to iron out wrinkles that weren't there. Matthew kept clearing his throat. I poured them both coffee they didn't touch, and I waited, because I have learned that silence makes people say things faster than questions do. Finally, Matthew said, "Mom, we need to talk to you about the lake house." The lake house at Cedar Hollow was not just a piece of property to me. Robert and I bought that land back when it was nothing but pine trees and mosquitoes. And we built that cabin one summer at a time, board by board, because that's all we could afford. Matthew took his first steps on that dock. We scattered a part of Robert's ashes into that water for years ago. On a morning so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. That house was not wood and glass to me. It was every good thing that ever happened to my family, held together with nails and 40 years of Saturdays. So when my son sat at my table and told me that Rachel's parents, Frank and Linda, were struggling, that they'd lost their home in Ohio after Frank's business went under, that they had nowhere to go and no money to get anywhere, I felt for them. I really did. Nobody deserves to lose their home at their age. But then Matthew said the words that changed the temperature of that whole kitchen. "We think you should give them the lake house." I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at my son's face, searching for the part of him that was joking. There wasn't one. "Give it to them," I repeated. "Not sell it, give it." Rachel spoke up then, her voice soft and rehearsed, like she'd practiced the speech in the car on the way over. "Eleanor, you barely use the lake house anymore. You go up maybe twice a year. My parents have nothing. They're 68 years old and they're living in an extended stay motel off Route 9. It would mean the world to them. To us. I want you to understand something about me before I go further into this story. I am not a woman who says no easily to my son. Matthew is my only child. His father died 4 years ago and left a hole in my life that I have not managed to fill. And I would climb through fire for that boy if he asked me to. So when he sat there and asked me to hand over the one physical place on this earth that still smelled like his father, I did not slam my hand on the table and throw them both out. Though God knows a small, tired part of me wanted to. Instead, I asked for one night to think about it. And I want you to notice that word too. Think. Not decide. Not agree. Think. That night I sat alone in my house with a cup of tea going cold in my hands. And I thought about my husband. And I thought about my son. And I thought about a man named Frank Whitmore who I had met exactly 4 times in my life. Twice at holiday dinners and twice in passing. And who I knew almost nothing about beyond the fact that his business had failed and his daughter had married my son. I did not know why his business failed. Nobody had told me that part. And in my 75 years on this earth, I have learned that the parts people leave out of a story are usually the parts that matter most. The next morning I called Matthew and told him I would agree to transfer the lake house to Frank and Linda. Relief flooded his voice so fast, I could hear it crack. But then I said the sentence that made that relief go very, very quiet. "On one condition." "What condition?" Matthew asked, and I could hear Rachel in the background asking him what I'd said. I told him this. I would transfer the deed of the lake house to Frank and Linda. Free and clear. No money exchanged. On one legal condition written into the transfer itself, the property would be held in a family protection trust for 10 years. During those 10 years, the house could not be sold, refinanced, used as collateral for a loan, or transferred to anyone else without my written consent. After 10 years, the trust would dissolve and the property would belong to Frank and Linda outright. No strings, to do with as they pleased. I told my son I wasn't doing this to control his in-laws. I was doing it because I am a woman who worked 41 years as a bookkeeper before I retired. And in 41 years of looking at other people's finances, I learned that desperate people make desperate decisions. And a paid-off lake house, sitting free and clear, is exactly the kind of thing a desperate person sells the moment nobody's looking. Matthew went quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then he said, "Mom, that feels a little insulting, like you don't trust them." "I don't know them," I said. "There's a difference between not trusting someone and not knowing them yet. I'm willing to learn to know them. But I built that house with your father's hands, Matthew, and I am not signing it over without a safety net under it. That's not me being cruel. That's me being careful. You should want me to be careful." There was a pause, and then Rachel's voice came on the line, having taken the phone from her husband. "Eleanor, I understand. Truly I do. But this is going to feel like a slap in the face to my parents. Like you're saying they can't be trusted with a gift." "Rachel," I said, as gently as I could manage, "it's not a gift if there's a rope attached that only tightens. It's a gift if it comes with a decade of safety for everyone, including your parents, who will never have to worry about losing that roof to a bank or a bad decision. Because the trust protects them too. I am protecting Frank and Linda just as much as I am protecting myself. If I am wrong about them, this costs them nothing. If I am right to be careful, it saves everyone a world of pain." I did not tell her the whole truth that day, which was that something about the phone call had already planted a small cold seed of worry in my stomach. The kind of feeling I used to get 30 years ago when a client's ledger didn't quite add up. Back before I even knew what was wrong, just that something was. They agreed eventually, because they didn't really have a choice. It was my house to give or not give. The lawyers drew up the trust that August. Frank and Linda came to my house to sign the papers, and I met them properly for the first time. Really sat and talked with them for more than 20 minutes. Frank Whitmore was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of handshake that tries too hard to prove something. He talked a great deal about a new business idea he was working on, something to do with commercial real estate consulting, and he talked about it the way men talk about things that don't exist yet, but that they've already spent money pretending do. Linda was quieter, kinder in a way that felt more genuine, and she thanked me 3 separate times that afternoon for what I was doing for them, each time with tears standing in her eyes that never quite fell. I wanted, very badly, to like them, and in a lot of ways that day, I did. Linda hugged me before she left, and she smelled like lavender, and she held onto my hands a second longer than a polite goodbye required. And she said, "You have no idea what this means, Eleanor. We will take care of that house like it's the most precious thing we've ever owned. I promise you that." I believed her. I want you to know that. Whatever happened after, whatever came next in this story, on that August afternoon, I believed Linda Whitmore with my whole heart. The papers were signed. The deed transferred in September. Frank and Linda moved into the lake house at Cedar Hollow before the leaves even started turning. And for a while, it seemed like I had done a good thing. Matthew called me more often that fall than he had in the 2 years before it, thanking me, telling me how much lighter Rachel seemed now that her parents were settled, telling me I'd done a good thing for the family. I let myself believe the cold feeling in my stomach had just been an old woman's suspicion, nothing more. A habit left over from too many years reading other people's numbers. I was wrong, and it took exactly 7 months for me to find out how wrong I was. It started with a phone call from a woman named Carol Dunmore, who ran the little hardware store in the town closest to Cedar Hollow Lake. Robert and I had bought nails and paint and fishing line from that store for 40 years. And Carol had known my husband well enough to cry at his funeral. She called me on a Tuesday evening in April, and her voice had that careful, apologetic tone people use when they're about to tell you something they know you don't want to hear. "Eleanor," she said, I don't want to speak out of turn, and stop me if this isn't my business. But I saw something in the paper I thought you should know about. Your lake house. The one by the North Bend. It's listed for sale. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said that. In my kitchen by the window, looking out at my own backyard. And for a moment the whole world just went quiet and far away, like I was hearing her through water. Listed for sale, I repeated. 340,000, Carol said. Realtors got a sign up at the end of the driveway and everything. I figured maybe you knew and just hadn't mentioned it. But something told me to call, because it didn't sit right with me. Frank's been in the store a few times lately. And Eleanor, I hate to say it, but he doesn't look like a man who's doing well. I thanked Carol, hung up the phone, and sat down at my kitchen table for a long time without moving. I want to tell you that my first feeling was anger, but it wasn't. My first feeling was grief, the exact same grief I felt the week after Robert died. A hollowed-out feeling in my chest like something had been scooped out of me with a spoon. Then the anger came, and when it came in like a tide. Slow at first and then all at once. And it did not leave for a very long time. I did not call Matthew first. I want to be honest with you about that. Because a part of this story is about learning that sometimes love makes you protect the wrong people first. I called my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise Okafor who had drawn up the trust in the first place. I told her what Carol had told me, and I asked her, calmly as I could manage, what my legal position was. Your position, Denise said, is that they cannot sell that house. Not without your written consent, which you have not given. If there's a listing active, that realtor either doesn't know about the trust restriction, or somebody didn't tell them about it on purpose. Either way, it's a legal non-starter. I can have a cease and desist to the listing agent by tomorrow morning. Do it, I said. But Denise, I want to know why. Before you send anything, I want to know why they're trying to sell a house they've owned for 7 months. It took Denise 3 days to find out. Because it turns out, Frank Whitmore's financial life was a great deal more complicated than a failed real estate consulting business. What she found, working with a forensic accountant she used for cases like this, was that Frank hadn't lost his old house in Ohio because of a failed business at all. He had lost it because of gambling debt. Nearly $200,000 of it, built up over almost 4 years at 2 different casinos and through an online sports betting account that Linda, it seemed, genuinely did not know existed. The business failure story Matthew had told me, the story I had felt so much sympathy for, was a story Frank had told his own daughter, who had believed it completely and passed it on to my son in perfect good faith. Frank had racked up new debt within months of moving into the lake house, somewhere around $110,000 of it this time. And a man who owes $110,000 to people who do not send polite letters in the mail does not have the luxury of waiting 10 years for a trust to dissolve. He needed the house sold fast, quietly, before anyone in the family found out how bad it had actually gotten again. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I said a word to anyone. I am not proud of what I did during those 2 days, but I will tell you the truth of it. Because you deserve the whole story and not just the parts that make me look kind. During those 2 days, I thought about exactly how I wanted this to unfold. I thought about the fact that Frank Whitmore had sat at my kitchen table and talked to me about his imaginary consulting business while his real business was quietly bleeding my late husband's lake house dry. I thought about Linda holding my hands and promising to take care of that house like it was the most precious thing they'd ever owned. And I wondered whether she'd meant it, or whether she was simply better than her husband at telling people what they wanted to hear. And I decided that whatever happened next, it was not going to happen quietly, behind closed doors, smoothed over at a private lunch somewhere so that everyone could keep pretending things were fine. It was going to happen in front of the whole family, at the one event where nobody could slip out early or change the subject. Matthew's birthday dinner was in 9 days. Rachel was hosting it at their house, and Frank and Linda would be there, and so would I. I decided I would bring the paperwork. In those 9 days, I did not confront Matthew. I did not call Rachel. I did not drive up to Cedar Hollow and stand on my own porch and demand answers from Frank and Linda directly, though every instinct in my body wanted to. I have learned something in 75 years that I will pass on to you now. Whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from. When someone has wronged you quietly, exposing them quietly only lets them manage the damage. It lets them get their story straight before anyone else hears it. And I did not want Frank Whitmore getting his story straight. I wanted the truth to land in that room the way it had landed on me, all at once, with no warning and no time to prepare a smooth answer. So I worked with Denise instead. She got the cease and desist to the listing agent, who pulled the sign from the driveway within a day and, appalled, admitted that Frank had told him the property was solely his to sell and had never mentioned any trust. Denise pulled the full financial picture together into a folder, bank statements showing the casino withdrawals, the online betting account activity, a letter from a collections agency addressed to Frank that had apparently been intercepted from the mailbox and never shown to Linda. It was not gossip. It was not suspicion. It was documented, dated, undeniable fact. 22 pages of it. And I put that folder in a plain manila envelope, and I put that envelope in my purse. And I drove to my son's birthday dinner with it sitting beside me on the passenger seat the whole way there. Matthew's house smelled like garlic and roasted chicken when I walked in. There were balloons tied to the porch railing, 42 of them, one for each year of his life. And my grandchildren, Sophie and little Ben, came running to hug my legs the second I stepped through the door. And for just a moment, standing there in that warm, noisy kitchen, I almost lost my nerve. Almost. Because underneath all of it, this was still a birthday party for my son, and I was about to turn it into something else entirely. Linda was setting the table when I came in, and she smiled at me, warm as ever, and asked how the drive-up had been. I told her it had been fine. I did not tell her that her husband owed $110,000 to people who did not send polite letters, or that he had tried to sell my dead husband's lake house out from under all of us. I simply smiled back, and I set my purse down on the side table by the door, close enough that I could reach it easily when the time came, and I helped carry the salad to the table. We sat down to eat around 6:30, Matthew at the head of the table, Rachel beside him, Frank and Linda across from me, the children between us, Sophie chattering about a school project, Ben more interested in his mashed potatoes than the conversation. It was, for the first 20 minutes, a perfectly normal family dinner. Matthew opened a card from Sophie covered in glitter glue. Rachel poured wine. Frank told a long story about a fishing trip he'd taken up at the lake. And I sat there and listened to a man describe fishing on a dock my husband built with his own two hands while knowing exactly what that man had been trying to do to it behind everyone's back. And I want you to understand, I have never in my life had to work so hard to keep my face still. When the cake came out and the candles were lit, and everyone sang, I waited. I let Matthew make his wish. I let him blow out every one of his 42 candles. I let the room settle back into its chairs. Plates of cake passed around. Coffee poured. And then, when the noise had quieted to that soft after-dinner hum, I reached over to the side table where I had left my purse and I pulled out the manila envelope. And I set it down in the center of the table, right next to the birthday cake. And I said, before we finish tonight, there's something everyone at this table needs to see. The room went still in the particular way a room goes still when everyone senses something is about to change permanently. Rachel's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Matthew looked at the envelope, then at me, confusion just starting to gather in his face. Linda's smile faded slowly, like a light dimming, and Frank went very, very pale, in a way that told me some part of him already knew exactly what was in that envelope before I said another word. Mom, Matthew said carefully. What is this? This, I said, is the reason the lake house had a for sale sign at the end of the driveway 3 weeks ago. A sign that was taken down after my lawyer sent a legal notice, because your father-in-law tried to sell that house without my consent, which the trust I set up specifically requires. And this, I tapped the envelope, is the reason he needed to sell it so badly and so quietly. Eleanor, Frank started, his voice already climbing towards something defensive. That is not what happened. There's a misunderstanding here. There is no misunderstanding, Frank, I said, and I want you to know my voice did not shake. Not once. Not the whole time. There are bank statements. There is a collections letter. There is $110,000 of gambling debt that you built up in 7 months while living in a house I gave you free of charge. And you were going to sell that house to pay it off without telling your wife, without telling my son, without telling me, the woman who trusted you enough to put her late husband's home in your name. Linda made a small sound, almost a gasp, and turned to look at Frank. And in her face, I saw something break that I don't think ever fully went back together. Not that night. Maybe not ever. Frank, she said, very quietly. Is that true? Frank did not answer her. He was looking at me instead, and something in his expression shifted from panic to something colder, something almost accusing, as though I were the one who had done something wrong. You had us investigated, he said. You went behind our backs and had us investigated like criminals. I protected my family, I said. That is what the trust was for. That is exactly, precisely, what I told you and Matthew and Rachel it was for. 7 months ago, sitting at my own kitchen table, I told you I was being careful. You told me it felt insulting. Well, Frank, I would like you to sit with the fact that it turns out I was right to be careful, and that the insult you felt was never about me not trusting you. It was about you already knowing you couldn't be trusted. Rachel had started to cry by then, silent tears running down her face. And she wasn't looking at her father. She was looking at her mother. And I understood in that moment that Rachel had truly not known any of this either. Whatever Frank's failures were, he had at least been thorough about hiding them from everyone who loved him. Matthew sat there for a long moment with his hand pressed flat against the tablecloth, staring at that envelope like it might bite him. And then he said, in a voice that had gone very small, Mom, why didn't you tell me first? Before tonight? Why did you do this here in front of everyone on my birthday? And this, right here, is the part of the story I have thought about more than any other part. Because it is the part where I have to tell you the truth about myself. And it is not a flattering truth. I looked at my son, and I said, because you didn't believe me 7 months ago when I told you. I had a bad feeling about this family, and you're not going to believe me now, unless the truth is sitting right here on the table where nobody in this room can look away from it. I am sorry it happened on your birthday, Matthew. I truly am. But I have spent my whole life being the person who smooths things over quietly so nobody feels uncomfortable. And I watched that quietness almost cost this family your father's lake house. I'm done being quiet. Frank stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. And for one long second I genuinely did not know what he was going to do. But he only grabbed his jacket off the back of the chair and said, I'm not sitting here and being humiliated at my own son-in-law's birthday dinner. And he walked out the front door without looking at any of us. Not even Linda. We heard his car start in the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires, and then the sound of it fading down the street. And the silence he left behind in that dining room was one of the loudest silences I have ever sat inside of. Linda did not go after him. She sat very still with her hands folded in her lap, staring at a spot on the tablecloth. And after what felt like a full minute she said, I need everyone to know I did not know. I swear to you, Eleanor, Matthew, Rachel, I swear on my own life I did not know about any of this. He told me the business consulting was going well. He told me we were finally getting back on our feet. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. And I am so ashamed of that right now that I can hardly look at any of you. I want to tell you that my anger softened completely toward Linda in that moment. And mostly it did, because I did believe her. And I still believe her to this day. But I also want to be honest that a small, hard part of me was thinking about 10 years of trust, restrictions, and wondering whether that small part of me had been the only reasonable person in that entire agreement from the very start. Matthew did not speak to me again that night. Not one word. He walked me out to my car at the end of the evening, silent the whole way. And when I turned to hug him goodbye, he let me, but his arms stayed loose at his sides. And he said only, I need some time, Mom, before he turned and walked back into his house. I drove home alone in the dark with the radio off. And I cried the whole way. Not because I regretted what I had done, but because I understood, clearly, for the first time, that doing the right thing and doing the thing that keeps everyone close to you are not always the same choice. And that night I had picked the first one and lost, for a while the second. The weeks that followed were some of the loneliest of my life since Robert died. Matthew did not call. He did not answer when I called him. Not for 11 days, which I know because I counted every single one of them. The way you count things when silence from someone you love becomes its own kind of physical ache. Rachel called once, about a week after the dinner, and her voice was raw and tired. And she told me that she and Matthew had barely spoken about anything other than logistics since that night. That the house felt like it was holding its breath. "I'm not angry at you, Eleanor," Rachel said. "I want you to know that. I've had a week to think about it, and I keep coming back to the same thing. You tried to protect us 7 months ago and we made you feel small for it. My dad lied to my face for years, and you're the one who found out. And somehow you're the one everyone's mad at. That's not fair. And I know it's not fair. And I'm sorry Matthew's been so quiet with you. How's your mother?" I asked. Rachel was quiet for a moment. "She moved out," she said. "Not divorcing him. Not yet. But she moved into a rental about 20 minutes from us. She said she needs to figure out if she can trust a single word he's ever told her before she decides anything permanent. She's in therapy twice a week. My dad's in some kind of gambling recovery program. Apparently, though I don't know how much of that is real and how much of it is him trying to save face with the rest of us." Denise, my lawyer, had by then formally enforced the trust. The house at Cedar Hollow remained in Frank and Linda's names, but under strict legal supervision. Every financial transaction related to that property now required my written approval and a co-signature from Denise's office for the remainder of the 10-year term. Frank was furious about it. He sent me one long, bitter email about how I had turned his own daughter's family against him, how I had used lawyers like weapons, how I would regret making an enemy out of him. I did not respond to that email. I forwarded it to Denise, and I went back to my quiet house, and I sat with the strange, uncomfortable feeling of having been right about something, in a way that had cost me almost everything I'd been trying to protect. In the first place, it was Sophie, of all people, my 9-year-old granddaughter, who finally cracked things open again. She called me on her mother's phone one evening in late May, almost a month after the birthday dinner, and she said, without any preamble at all, "The way only a 9-year-old can manage, Grandma. Why don't you come to my dance recital anymore? You never miss my dance recitals." I told her I had missed the date, which was a lie, and a bad one, because I had not missed it. I had simply assumed wrongly that I was no longer welcome at family things until Matthew decided otherwise. Sophie was quiet for a second and then she said, "Daddy misses you." He doesn't say it, but he does the thing where he stares at his phone like he's going to call somebody, and then he doesn't. He does that a lot now. I don't know if a 9-year-old fully understands the weight of the things she says sometimes, or if some part of children understands it perfectly and adults are the ones who've forgotten how to say things plainly. Either way, I called Matthew that same night, and this time, he picked up on the second ring. "Mom," he said, and just from the way he said that one word, I could hear that a month of silence had worn something down in him. "I've been trying to figure out how to call you for 2 weeks now." "You could have just called," I said, gentler than I meant to sound, because the truth is, I had missed him so much it had become a physical weight sitting behind my ribs. "I know," he said. I kept starting the call and then thinking about what I was going to say, and none of it sounded right in my head. "I think the truth is I didn't know how to call you without saying I was wrong, and I wasn't ready to say I was wrong, because saying that meant admitting I picked my wife's family's comfort over my own mother's judgment, and that's a hard thing to sit with about yourself." "You didn't pick them over me," I said. "You just believed the story they told you." "That's not the same as choosing against me, Matthew. It's just what happens when the people you love lie to you well enough." He was quiet for a moment, and I heard him exhale, long and slow, the way his father used to when he was working through something difficult. "I keep thinking about that dinner," he said, "about how humiliated I felt watching that happen at my own birthday party. And it took me weeks to admit to myself that the humiliation wasn't really about you exposing Frank. It was about me, realizing how wrong I'd been to make you feel small for protecting us. You tried to tell me, Mom, back in June, at the kitchen table, You tried to tell me you had a bad feeling, and I basically told you your instincts were an insult to my wife's family. I've been so angry at you for weeks, and it took me this long to understand. I wasn't actually angry at you at all. I was angry at myself, and it was easier to point it at you. I did not say anything for a moment, because I did not trust my voice not to break. And then I said, I would have rather been wrong about Frank and had my son speaking to me, Matthew. I want you to know that. Whatever I said at that dinner, whatever I did with that envelope, none of it was ever about winning some argument with you. It was about protecting this family. All of it, including Frank and Linda, whether they understood that or not. I have never once, not for a single day of my life, stopped loving you more than I love being right. He was crying by then. I could hear it in the way his breath caught. 42 years old and crying on the phone with his mother. And there is nothing in this world quite like hearing your grown child cry that. Makes you forget every ounce of anger you thought you were entitled to keep holding on to. Can I come see you this weekend? He asked. Just me first. I want to look at you when I say I'm sorry, not do it over the phone. He came that Saturday alone, and we sat on my back porch with 2 cups of coffee going cold between us. Much like the one I'd sat with the night before I agreed to that whole arrangement in the first place. And he told me everything. He told me how ashamed he'd felt watching Frank walk out of that dinner. How for the first week after, his shame had curdled into anger at me because it was easier than sitting with his own blindness. How Rachel had been the one to finally sit him down 2 weeks in and ask him, quietly, whether he was angry at his mother or angry at himself, and how he hadn't had an honest answer for her. I want to ask you something, Matthew said, staring out at my yard rather than at me. The way men in my family have always found it easier to say hard things while looking somewhere else. Do you forgive Frank? I thought about that question for a long time before I answered it, because I wanted to give him the truth and not just the answer that would make the afternoon easier. I don't know yet, I said finally. I forgive people for being human and flawed and scared enough to hide things. Everybody in this family has been that at some point, myself included. What I don't yet know if I forgive is whether he's actually changed, or whether he's just sorry he got caught. Those are 2 very different things, Matthew, and only time tells you which one you're looking at. I'm willing to watch and find out. I'm not willing to pretend I already know the answer. Matthew nodded slowly, like that was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a month. And maybe it was. Summer turned into fall, and fall turned into a long, quiet winter. And over those months, something in my family slowly began to knit itself back together, thread by careful thread. Matthew called every Sunday without fail, sometimes just to talk about nothing in particular. The weather, a work project, whether Ben had finally learned to ride his bike without training wheels. I understood those calls for what they were. He was rebuilding something, one ordinary conversation at a time. The same patient way you rebuild anything that's been broken and matters too much to rush. Rachel and I grew closer that winter than we had ever been before, which surprised me, given everything. She started stopping by on Wednesday afternoons sometimes, just the 2 of us. And over tea she told me things I don't think she'd told anyone else. How growing up she had always sensed something unsteady underneath her father's confidence, but had never had the words for it as a child. How she had spent her whole adult life slightly braced for a phone call telling her something had gone wrong, without ever quite knowing what that something would be. I think some part of me married into your family because it felt steady. She told me one afternoon, Matthew's family felt like a house that wasn't going to fall down. I think that's part of why it hurts so much, realizing my own father might knock it down anyway. I told her that families are not steady because nothing bad ever happens inside them. They are steady because when something bad does happen, somebody is willing to stand up in the middle of dinner and put it on the table where everyone can see it, instead of letting it rot quietly in a drawer for years. She cried a little at that. And so did I. And it was a good kind of crying. The kind that clears something out rather than the kind that just hurts. Linda and I kept in touch too. More than I expected to. She called me every few weeks from her little rental apartment. And slowly, over months, I watched a woman rebuild. A sense of herself that had apparently been quietly eroding for years under the weight of a marriage built on things she wasn't allowed to know about. She got a part-time job at a garden center, something she told me she'd wanted to do for 20 years and never had the nerve to pursue while she was busy managing Frank's moods and Frank's stories and Frank's slow, unraveling finances. I feel guilty saying this, she told me once, but some days I feel more like myself living alone in that little apartment than I felt in 22 years of marriage. I don't know what that says about me. I told her it said she'd spent 22 years being strong for somebody who never once thanked her properly for it, and that noticing you feel more like yourself when the weight comes off isn't guilt. It's just honesty finally catching up to how tired you've been. Frank, for his part, did something I genuinely had not expected him to do. He stayed in the recovery program, not for a month, not for 3 months as a show for the family, but for the better part of a year, showing up every week. And around the following spring, nearly 10 months after that birthday dinner, he asked Denise, my lawyer, whether he could set up a formal meeting with me. Not through Matthew, not through Linda directly, through my own attorney, in writing, requesting 15 minutes of my time. I almost said no. I sat with that request for 3 full days before I agreed to it, because some wounds take exactly as long as they take, and I was not going to pretend mine had healed faster than it had simply because a year had passed on a calendar. We met at a small diner halfway between our two towns. Neutral ground. Denise's suggestion. Frank looked different than the man who had walked out of that birthday dinner 10 months earlier. Thinner, grayer, quieter. The kind of forced confidence that used to fill up every room he walked into had gone somewhere and not come back. And in its place was something more careful, more tired, more honest, I think, than I had ever seen on him before. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me today, he said, before I'd even taken my coat off. I've thought about this meeting for weeks and I decided the worst thing I could do is walk in here, asking you for something again. I just wanted to look you in the eye and tell you that everything you found in that folder was true, every bit of it, and that I am sorrier than I know how to say, not because I got caught, though I know that's what it looks like, but because I spent 7 months living in a house your husband built with his own hands, while lying to every single person who trusted me with it. I think about that a lot. I think about the fact that a man who built something with love handed it to me, through you, and I nearly gambled it away without telling a soul. I sat with that for a moment, turning my coffee cup slowly on its saucer, and then I asked him the only question I actually needed an answer to. Why should I believe this is different from every other promise you've made and broken, Frank? You shouldn't, he said simply. Not yet. I don't think promises are worth much from a man like me right now. I think the only thing worth anything is time, and showing up, and letting you watch whether I actually do it or whether I fall apart again the way I always have before. I'm not asking you to trust me today. I'm asking if you'll let me earn it, slowly, the boring way, one ordinary year at a time, with the trust restriction still in place for as long as you want it there. I signed up for 10 years knowing full well I hated it at the time. I understand now why you insisted on it. I think, honestly, it might be the only reason any of us still have that house. I did not tell Frank I forgave him that day, because I didn't. Not fully. Not yet. But I told him I was willing to watch. The same thing I had told Matthew nearly a year earlier, and I meant it exactly as much the second time as I had the first. Watching turned out to be exactly the right choice. Though, I want to be honest and tell you it was not always an easy year to sit through quietly. There were moments that spring and summer where old habits in Frank flickered back to the surface. A defensive tone here, a small exaggeration there about how well things were going. And every single time, I noticed it. And every single time, instead of confronting him with anger, I simply asked him a plain, direct question. The kind that leaves no room for a story to hide inside. Every single time, to his credit, he answered honestly, even when the honest answer was uncomfortable, even when it made him look less impressive than the version of himself he clearly still wished he was. Linda found her own footing that year too, steadier every time I saw her. She and Frank did not get back together, not in the way of moving back in as husband and wife, but they found something else instead, a careful, respectful friendship built on 11 months of him actually doing the things he said he would do instead of just saying them. She told me once, over tea, that she had finally stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop every time he called her, and that this, more than anything, felt like the real proof that something in him had actually shifted. Matthew and Rachel's marriage, which had been the quiet casualty nobody talked about much in the middle of everything else, slowly found its footing too. I watched my son become, over that year, a more careful listener than he had been before, the kind of husband who asked more questions and assumed less. And I think, in a strange way, the whole painful mess of that year taught him something about paying attention that might have taken him another decade to learn otherwise. Rachel told me once that she and Matthew started going to counseling together that fall, not because their marriage was in danger exactly, but because they both wanted to understand why it had taken a stranger's phone call and a manila envelope on a birthday cake to make them see something that had been sitting in plain sight for months. We don't want to be people who need a crisis to pay attention to each other, she told me. We're trying to learn how to pay attention before the crisis this time. The following June, almost exactly 1 year after that birthday dinner, Matthew called me and asked if the whole family could come up to Cedar Hollow Lake for the weekend. All of us, Frank and Linda included. I sat with that request for a long moment on the phone. The same way I had sat with Frank's request for a meeting. The same way I had sat with the original decision to hand over the deed in the first place. All those years, all those decisions, all of them starting with me taking a breath and giving myself permission to think before I answered. All of us, I repeated. All of us, Matthew said. I know it's a lot to ask. I know you might not be ready. And if you're not, we absolutely will not push it. We'll wait as long as you need. But Sophie asked me last week why we never go to the lake house together, as a whole family anymore. And I didn't have a good answer for her. And I thought maybe it was time to see if we could build one. I drove up to Cedar Hollow on a Friday afternoon in June, almost exactly a year to the week since Carol Dunmore had called me about a for sale sign at the end of that driveway. And as I came around the last bend in the road and the lake came into view, blue and calm and glittering under the afternoon sun exactly the way it had looked every summer of my married life, I felt something in my chest loosen that had been held tight for 12 long months. Sophie and Ben were already down at the dock when I pulled in. Ben in an orange live vest 2 sizes too big for him, shrieking with laughter as Matthew swung him around in the shallow water near the shore. Rachel was setting up a table on the porch. The same porch, the same weathered gray boards Robert had sanded and stained one long August 3 decades ago. And Linda was in the kitchen, humming to herself while she sliced tomatoes for a salad, looking more at peace in that kitchen than I had ever seen her look in the whole 2 years I had known her. Frank was down by the water, alone, sitting on the end of the dock with his shoes off and his pants rolled up, feet dangling in the lake. And when he saw my car pull in, he stood up and walked toward me across the grass, slower than the confident stride I remembered from that first day at my kitchen table, but steadier somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with speed. "Eleanor," he said, "thank you for coming. Thank your daughter and my son for asking," I said, "and thank yourself a little for the year it took to get here." He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face, some last guarded piece of him, seemed to soften all at once. "I think about Robert sometimes," he said, "a man I never met. I think about the fact that he built this place with his own hands, board by board, the same way I've had to try to rebuild myself this past year. Slow, unglamorous, one piece at a time, no shortcuts. I hope, if there's any way for him to know, that he'd see I finally understand what I almost threw away. Not just a house, a whole family's trust in me. And I don't think I understood the size of that until I almost lost it completely. I stood on that dock, in the golden late afternoon light, looking out at the water, where a part of my husband's ashes had settled into the lake bed years ago. And for the first time since Carol Dunmore's phone call, I let myself feel something other than watchfulness toward Frank Whitmore. I let myself feel, cautiously, honestly, something close to forgiveness. That evening we all sat together on the back porch as the sun went down over the water, plates balanced on our knees, the smell of grilled corn and charcoal still hanging in the warm air. And I watched my family in a way I had not been able to watch them in over a year. Not with one eye always half braced for something to go wrong. Sophie had roped been into some elaborate game involving pine cones and an upturned bucket, their laughter carrying across the yard every few minutes. Matthew had his arms slung along the back of Rachel's chair, and every so often he'd lean over and say something low that made her laugh into her glass of lemonade. Linda was telling a story about a customer at the garden center who had tried to return a dead houseplant for a refund, insisting the plant had been defective. And even Frank laughed at that one. A real laugh, not the performative kind I remembered from that first dinner at my kitchen table 2 years earlier. At one point, as the sky turned the color of a ripe peach over the tree line across the water, Matthew stood up with his glass in his hand and cleared his throat, and the whole porch went quiet the way it does when somebody about to say something they've clearly been thinking about for a while. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'm not great at this kind of thing, so bear with me." He looked at me first. "Mom, a little over a year ago, you sat at this table, back when it was just the four of us signing papers, and you told us you were being careful, not cruel. I want to say, in front of everybody, that I didn't understand that sentence for a long time. I thought careful and cruel were closer together than they actually are. I know now they're about as far apart as two things can be. You built a fence around this family's most precious thing, not because you didn't trust us, but because you loved us enough to imagine the worst thing that could happen and refuse to let it happen quietly. I don't think I've ever thanked you properly for that, so I'm doing it now. In front of everyone, the way you did the hard thing in front of everyone a year ago." He turned to Frank next, and I watched Frank's jaw tighten, bracing, the way a man braces when he expects to be publicly reminded of his worst year. But Matthew just said, "And Frank, I want to say I've watched you this past year, quietly. The way my mother taught all of us to watch instead of just hope. I've watched you show up to that program every single week. I've watched you answer hard questions honestly, instead of dodging them the way you used to. I don't know if a year erases anything, and I don't think it's supposed to, but I see the work. We all see the work, and I wanted you to hear that out loud tonight, at this table. The same table where the worst of it came out into the open." Frank did not say anything for a long moment. He just nodded, his eyes bright in the fading light. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out rougher than usual. "That's the kindest thing anyone said to me in about 2 years," he said. "I'll take it. I don't think I've earned all of it yet, but I'll take it, and I'll keep working toward deserving the rest." Linda reached over and squeezed his hand, just once, a gesture between two people who had built something new out of the wreckage of something old, and then let it go. And somehow that small moment told me more about how far both of them had come than any speech could have. I did not say much that night. I have never been a woman who needs to fill a silence just because it's there. But later, after the dishes were done, and the children had fallen asleep in a tangle of blankets on the living room floor in front of the fireplace, I walked down to the dock alone, the way I used to walk down there with Robert on summer evenings after he'd finish whatever project he was working on that week. The water was black and still, the moon laying a long silver path across it, and I sat down at the very end of the dock, right where Frank had been sitting when I arrived that afternoon, and I let myself cry, quietly. The good kind of crying, the kind that comes after something has finally settled. I thought about the folder, and the birthday cake, and the 11 days of silence from my son, and Carol Dunmore's phone call, and Denise's cease and desist letter, and Frank walking out into the dark a year earlier with his jacket in his fist. I thought about every hard choice I had made in that year. Every moment I had chosen honesty over comfort, protection over peace, and I realized, sitting there in the moonlight, that I would make every single one of those choices again, exactly the same way, if I had to. Not because I enjoyed any part of the pain it caused, but because on the other side of all that pain was this. A family sitting together on a porch, laughing at a story about a dead houseplant, a granddaughter's game with pine cones, a son thanking me in front of everyone instead of resenting me quietly, a man who had once lied to my face now sitting, with his feet in the lake water, talking about my late husband with something that sounded, finally, like genuine respect. I heard footsteps on the dock behind me and turned to see Matthew walking toward me, 2 mugs of decaf coffee in his hands, one of which he held out to me as he sat down beside me on the weathered wood. "You okay out here, Mom?" he asked. "I'm better than okay," I told him, and meant it fully for the first time in over a year. He was quiet for a while, looking out at the water with me, and then he said, I keep thinking about how different things would have turned out if you'd just given us the house outright. No trust, no conditions. The way we originally asked, Frank probably would have sold it within the year and none of us would have ever known why. Until it was too late to do anything about it. We'd have just found out the house was gone. No folder. No dinner table conversation. No chance to fix any of it. That's the thing about protecting people you love, I said. Sometimes it looks like control in the moment. And it isn't until much later that anybody can see it was actually a form of faith. I had faith that if I built in enough safety, the truth would have somewhere to land eventually, instead of disappearing quietly the way truths so often do when nobody's watching closely enough. Matthew smiled at that. A real tired, contented smile. The kind that only comes at the end of a very long road. And we sat together on that dock for a long while after that, not saying much else. Just two people who loved each other, looking out at water that held so much of our family's history inside it. Watching the moonlight ripple every time a fish broke the surface, somewhere out in the dark. It has been 3 more years since that weekend, and I want to tell you a little about what happened after, because I think the ending of a story like this one matters just as much as the middle, maybe more, since so many stories about family betrayal never bother to show you what healing actually looks like once the drama has quieted down. The trust is still in place. It has 4 more years left on its original 10-year term, and I have never once considered ending it early. And Frank, to his enormous credit, has never once asked me to. Every transaction still requires my signature and Denise's, and every single one of them, for 3 years running now, has been exactly what it claimed to be on paper. Small repairs to the dock, a new water heater the winter before last. Nothing hidden, nothing rushed, nothing that made that cold, familiar feeling rise up in my stomach the way it did the spring. Carol Dunmore called me. Frank still attends his recovery meetings, though less often now, once a month instead of every week, which his sponsor apparently told him is a healthy sign rather than a warning sign, given how consistent he's been. He got a real job 2 years ago. Nothing glamorous. An assistant manager position at a hardware store 2 towns over from Cedar Hollow. And he told me once, with a kind of quiet pride I had never once heard in his voice during all his talk of consulting businesses, that he likes it because at the end of every single day, he can see exactly what he accomplished. Nothing invisible, nothing that depends on convincing anyone of anything. Just inventory counted, customers helped, a register that balances or doesn't. Linda bought a small house of her own last year, close enough to the lake that she visits Frank for dinner sometimes, close enough to her grandchildren that she sees them nearly every week. She and Frank never remarried, and I don't think they ever will. But what they built instead, slowly, out of the wreckage, is something I've come to respect almost as much as I would have respected a repaired marriage. 2 people who hurt each other badly, choosing honesty with each other anyway, choosing to keep showing up for the family they made, together even after the marriage that made it couldn't survive what one of them had done. Matthew and Rachel are, by every measure I can see from the outside, happier than they were even before any of this happened. They still go to counseling, though less frequently now too. And Rachel told me last month that she thinks the whole ordeal, painful as it was, taught both of them to stop assuming the people they love are fine just because nobody's said otherwise. We check in now, she said. Really check in. Not just ask how was your day and accept whatever answer we get. I don't think we would have learned that without everything that happened. I hate that it took something this hard to teach us, but I'm grateful we learned it while we're still young enough to build the rest of our marriage around it. Sophie is 12 now, and taller than I ever expected a granddaughter of mine to be at 12. And she has taken, this past year, to spending long afternoons at the lake house with her grandfather Frank, learning to fish off that same dock where her own grandfather, Robert, used to sit decades before she was born. She doesn't know the whole story. Not yet. The specific details of death and deception in a folder on a birthday cake. Someday, when she's older, if she asks, I will tell her the whole truth of it. The way I've told you tonight. Because I don't believe in protecting children from the truth about people forever. Only for as long as they need protecting. What she does know, What all of us made sure she would always know is that her family went through something very hard. And instead of falling apart, we chose, every single one of us, over and over, across 3 long years, to keep choosing each other anyway. Ben is 7 now, and he doesn't remember any of it at all. And honestly, that might be my favorite outcome of this entire story. He just remembers a lake house full of people who love him, a grandfather Frank who teaches him how to bait a hook, a grandmother Eleanor who lets him stay up too late catching fireflies in a jar, a mother and father who laugh easily together on the porch in the evenings. He gets to have the family on the other side of the healing without ever having to carry the weight of what it took to get there. And I think, in the end, that's exactly what all that hard work was for. I still think about that folder sometimes, sitting in the center of a birthday cake table, and about how frightened I was driving up to that dinner, that I was about to destroy my family instead of save it. I have learned, in the years since, that those two outcomes were never actually as close together as they felt that night. What felt in the moment like the end of everything turned out to be the very beginning of the only version of my family that could survive honestly, out in the open, instead of quietly rotting from the inside the way secrets always eventually do. If there is one thing I would want anyone listening to this story to carry away with them, it is this: protecting the people you love is not the same as controlling them. And it is not the same as distrusting them either. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to build in a little bit of safety nobody asked for. Hold your ground when it makes you unpopular at the dinner table, and trust that the people who truly love you will eventually understand why you did it, even if it takes them a hard, lonely year to get there. I gave away my lake house on one condition. And that one condition ended up saving far more than a piece of property. It saved every single relationship I would have lost if I had simply said yes and hoped for the best. We still go up to Cedar Hollow Lake every summer, all of us, the whole complicated, healed, hard-won family of us. And every single time I drive around that last bend in the road and see the water come into view, blue and calm and glittering exactly the way it looked the summer Robert and I first cleared that land with nothing but a truck full of lumber and more hope than sense, I think about how close I came to losing all of it, and how grateful I am every single time that I chose to be careful instead of easy, and that my family eventually chose to forgive me for it. That first birthday dinner, the one where I set that manila envelope down next to a cake, with 42 candles still smoking on top of it, sits in my memory now not as the worst night of that whole ordeal, but as the turning point that made every good thing after it possible. I think about Frank walking out into the dark that night, and I think about him walking toward me, across the grass a year later with his shoes off and his pants rolled up, and I think about how far a person can travel in 12 months if the people around him refuse to lie to him about what he's done, and refuse just as fiercely to give up on the possibility that he can become someone different. I am 78 years old now, 3 years older than I was the Sunday my son first sat down at my kitchen table and asked me to give away the one place on this earth that still smelled like his father. I don't have as many years left as I've already lived, and I think that's part of why I wanted to tell you this story tonight, exactly the way it happened, without smoothing over the ugly parts or rushing past the slow, unglamorous work of forgiveness. Because forgiveness was never the easy, sudden thing people sometimes make it sound like. It was 3 years of small, boring, consistent honesty. One Sunday phone call at a time, one signed document at a time, one dog conversation at a time, until one day I looked up and realized the anger simply wasn't there anymore, replaced by something steadier and far more valuable. My lake house still belongs on paper to Frank and Linda Whitmore, and in 4 more years, when that trust finally dissolves, it will belong to them completely. No conditions, no signatures required, no safety net beneath it at all. And for the first time since the day I insisted on that condition at my own kitchen table, I find myself looking forward to that day, not because I'll finally be free of the responsibility of watching over it, but because I have come to believe, slowly, hard-won year by hard-won year, that they have finally, truly earned it. Robert would have liked Frank, I think, in the end. if not at the beginning. My husband was a patient man, the kind who believed people could be rebuilt. The same slow way he rebuilt an old boat engine out in the garage every spring, piece by piece, testing each part before moving on to the next, never assuming the whole thing worked, just because it looked put together on the outside. I think he would have understood, better than I did in that first painful year, that the condition I placed on that lake house was never really about Frank at all. It was about honoring the kind of care Robert put into everything he built, by refusing to let it fall into anyone's hands, family included, without the same careful attention he would have given it himself. So that is my story. The whole true shape of it. From a kitchen table conversation on an ordinary Sunday to a dock in the moonlight 3 years later. A lake house, a condition, a folder on a birthday cake, a year of silence, and a family that chose, slowly and imperfectly and completely on purpose, to become something stronger than the secret that almost tore it apart. So tell me, where are you watching this from tonight? Comment your city below. I love reading every single one of them before I go to bed. And if this story moved you even a little, if it made you think about your own grandmother, or your own family, or the quiet, careful ways love sometimes has to fight to protect the people inside it, then do me one small favor, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and share this with someone who needs a reminder that protecting the people you love is never the same thing as controlling them. Thank you for sitting with me tonight, wherever you're watching from. Whichever city, whichever kitchen table, whichever quiet porch you're sitting on right now. I'll see you next time. And until then, please take care of the people who take good care of you.